Hello, I'm Jeff Cavins, and today we're looking at the readings for the Feast of the Transfiguration of the Lord. When it comes to our relationship with God, one of the basic questions that we always ask is, does He love me? Will He continue with me even if I struggle? And the answer is yes, yes, yes. In this week's readings in Romans chapter 8, Paul says, nothing in fact can separate us from the love of Christ. In the very first paragraph of the Catechism, it mentions that God has gone in search of you and me, and He wants to adopt us as sons and daughters and bring us into His family, the church, so that He can share His blessed life with us. He always has your best in mind, and nothing can separate us from the love of Christ. We see this even in the Old Testament, clear back at the Exodus, where God went in search of His people who were being mistreated by the Egyptians. He heard their cry and their supplication, and He sent Moses to deliver them. And afterward, after this great deliverance on eagle's wings, they go into the desert for 40 years. During that period of time, God took care of them. He fed them, He clothed them, He watched over them and protected them. And He still does the same thing today. Now, one of the keys to understanding Scripture, particularly in the New Testament, is that we need to focus on the idea that Jesus fulfills everything in the Old Testament. He fulfills everything by reliving everything in His life. And so when we think back about the Exodus, we think about freedom. We think about freedom from bondage and God's provision. In the reading this week, we're looking at the Transfiguration. When you first look at it, you might not think about the Exodus in the Old Testament, but as I read some of the clues here, it starts to become evident that this is a fulfillment of the Exodus in the Old Testament. But it's a new Exodus, not an Exodus from Egyptian slavery, but an Exodus from sin, from the real enemy, which is Satan. In Matthew chapter 17, after 6 days, Jesus took with Him Peter and James and John, His brother, and led them up a high mountain apart. And He was transfigured before them, and His face shone like the sun, and His garments became white as light. Now already this should remind you of the story of the Exodus, where Moses and others went up on the mountain, and the Shekinah glory, the very presence of God, shone on Moses to the point where his face actually was shining as a result of it. And behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with Him. Now Moses and Elijah represent the law and the prophets. And Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is well that we are here. If you wish, I will make 3 booths here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. Now, I got to be honest with you. This is one of those points in Scripture where I kind of chuckle, because here Peter is with Jesus, Moses, and Elijah, and Jesus is being transfigured on top of this mountain, which many believe is Mount Tabor in Galilee, and he comes up with this statement, this is good to be here. You think? This is incredible to be on top of the mountain. And He was still speaking when, behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to Him. And when the disciples heard this, they fell on their faces and were filled with awe. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, Rise, have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus alone. Now, we've got to ask ourselves, what's happening on top of this mountain? And why did Peter decide that they should build 3 booths? Now, without understanding the Old Testament, you could interpret 3 booths as memorials. We're going to have 3 memorials. We got Jesus, Moses, and Elijah. That would be a great thing. But when we talk about a booth here, we're not talking about a memorial. We're talking about something that Israel utilized in the Old Testament during the Exodus. You see, during the Exodus, they lived in booths, which was significant because this was their shelter during this Exodus and during this journey. And so Peter recognizes that what is happening here is a fulfillment of the Old Testament Exodus. But this is not a freedom from Egypt, as I said, but a freedom from sin. Now, when you read Luke's gospel, his interpretation of this and his telling of this, he actually mentions what Jesus spoke about. And he says that He spoke about His exodus, which will begin in Jerusalem. You see, the Holy Week of Jesus, the crucifixion, the burial, the resurrection of Jesus, is a fulfillment of the Exodus. And the Mass that we celebrate is a Mass of freedom. And so we can experience this love that we cannot be separated from in the Mass, in this New Testament Exodus. And I encourage you this week, lean into this text and say, Jesus, set me free. Set me free from the sins that have so easily entangled me, the addictions that have my heart. Set me free, Lord, as I celebrate the Transfiguration.